its function in that way. And that's what the world is organized. It changes. Circumstances change, but not very much in principle. In fact, a very striking illustration is what we're now commemorating, the fall of the Berlin Wall 20 years ago, yesterday. So what happened? Well, if the naive might have believed that NATO disappeared. NATO was presented as a means of defense against the Russian hordes. Okay, hordes are gone, NATO should disappear. And policies, say military interventionist policies and so on, would change because the great threat is gone. But what in fact happened? This is the first Bush administration. Immediately, the Bush administration came out with a national security strategy, which was and a budget, which explained that nothing at all would change except for the pretext. So we would still need a huge military establishment, but now the reason would be not the Russians, but the, I'm quoting, the technological sophistication of third world powers, and nobody laughed. We would still have to maintain what's called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry. The United States does not believe in a market system, contrary to pretenses. The advanced economy relies very extensively on the state sector, much of it under the pretext of defense. Computers, the internet, microelectronics, most of the high-tech these days, biotechnology and so on. So that would have to be maintained. They would call it the defense industrial base. What about intervention? Well, that was quite interesting. They said the administration said we must maintain intervention forces directed at the Middle East. And then came the following interesting comment. The Middle East energy resources, where the threats to our interests could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. In other words, apologies, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now the clouds have lifted, and we must maintain the same policies. But now we concede that they're aimed against independent, radical, it's called radical independent nationalism, and that the Russians were a pretext. What about NATO? NATO was created in theory to defend the West against the Russians. So you think NATO would disappear if you're naive. On the contrary, NATO at once began to expand. Gorbachev had made a remarkable concession. He had agreed to allow a unified Germany to join a hostile military alliance headed by the global superpower. That's pretty astonishing in the light of history. I mean, Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia twice during the century, and Germany within a hostile military alliance is much more threatening. There was, however, a quid pro quo. George Bush and James Baker promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand even to East Germany, let alone farther east. It wasn't even considered. And they promised him that NATO would become a more political organization. Well, what happened? Clinton became president. I can put aside the promise that NATO would become a more political organization. NATO began to expand to the east, did so even more under Bush. Obama wants to expand it farther. His national security advisor, James Jones, his former Marine commandant, is a vocal advocate of the idea that NATO should become a global system, essentially a global intervention force under U.S. command, expanding to the east and the south. The Secretary General of NATO, that must be Dutch, de Hoop Scheffer, he informed the NATO conference that NATO must take responsibility for ensuring energy supplies, the whole energy system for the West. That includes sea lanes, pipelines, countries that might be out of control, and so on. In other words, it must become a global military intervention force under U.S. command. A large part of the purpose of this is to ensure that Europe doesn't go off on an independent path. That was one of the main reasons for NATO. It was always concerned that Europe might take sort of a Gaullist line, concept of independent Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. That's been a serious threat. So that's to be stopped. Well, that's, and Obama wants to carry further. In the crucial Middle East region, Central Asia, Middle East region, Obama has made it very clear that he intends to expand the U.S. role. As I'm sure you know, there's a huge city inside Baghdad, which is called an embassy, but it's actually a city within a city, protected city within a city, not like any embassy in the world. The Bush administration had budgeted it for $1.5 billion this year. Obama's increased that to $1.8 billion for the next 2 years, and has announced similar mega embassies in Kabul and Islamabad, and also huge consulates in Peshawar and Kandahar and so on. These are all just indications that, yes, we're there to stay. And that's not surprising. You go back to the Second World War again, and the Middle East region would describe it. It was called, illustrating with the issue that is on the pages every day, the greatest threat in the world, namely Iranian nuclear weapons and Iranian missiles. So we're told Iran is an enormous, horrible government. There's no question about that, and a terrible human rights record. But consider what we're supposed to believe. Iran is violating Security Council resolutions. It's defying the world. It's concealing what it's doing from the International Atomic Energy Agency, terrible human rights record. Obama has recently reconfigured the missile defense system in Eastern Europe, as you know, and the question that's hotly debated is whether he's selling out to the Russians or whether this is in fact a better way to protect the West against the Iranian threat to survival and so on. That's the main story. And like all propaganda, it has the little particles of truth running through it. But let's take a closer look. So is Iran defying the world? Well, it depends how you define the world. If the world is defined as Washington, and anybody who happens to agree with it, yes, Iran is defying the world. If the world is defined as the world, then the world overwhelmingly supports Iran's right to enrich uranium, which is, as everyone agrees, a right that is accorded to every signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the non-aligned countries, which are the majority of the world, have repeatedly and strenuously vigorously endorsed that right. A large majority of Americans agree with them. That was 2 years ago. There's been a massive propaganda campaign, and attitudes sort of shifted in the U.S. But most of the world agrees with Iran on this. But that's not the world. The world means Washington and whoever shines its shoes. What about defying the Security Council? Well, it's true. There are Security Council resolutions that Iran is not adhering to. The most recent is just a few weeks ago, September 24th, Resolution 1887. This was presented as portrayed as a great victory for Obama in his conflict with Iran. Actually, if you look at the resolution, you can find it on the internet, it says nothing directly about Iran. It's directed against the United States, India, and Israel, explicitly. One provision of the resolution calls on all states to resolve their problems by peaceful means without threats. There's only two countries that are issuing threats, the United States and Israel. They're both threatening war. Actually, the